Hi, I'm John Davidson. We made this documentary about Tourette syndrome in 1989 for a series on BBC television called Q.E.D. It was made by a company called U.E.D and Associates from London. They came up to Scotland when they got in touch and spent nearly 2 weeks with me filming. Found it very hard, you know. It was something I felt we needed to do. Especially at the time, I'd just not been diagnosed, and just I needed to have people knowing what was wrong with me. You know, I'd walk down the street in my local town, Galashiels, and people would give me funny stares, funny looks. You know, they'd cross the road to avoid me, which really at times really hurt. You know, got me right in the stomach. But then, when we were making the documentary, it was almost like, you know, people were beginning to, you know, show an interest about what Tourette syndrome was, and I felt quite honoured to have been chosen to do the documentary, especially when the TV company, U.E.D and Associates, had looked at about, you know, 15, 20 other families with Tourette's. At the beginning of the documentary, you'll see my mum there, you know, contacting the local police station. The reason for this was, in the past, I'd been approached by police in the street, you know, and, you know, warned about, you know, shouting swear words and being loud and quite noisy in the street. And I was, you know, basically told, you need to be stopping this because we're going to lift you for breach of the peace, which, for someone with Tourette's that didn't know really much about it at the time, was quite kind of scary prospect about, you know, the police being involved and things like that. So when I got home, you know, being upset, got in touch, you know, got mum to phone the police station to explain about Tourette's. It helped, yeah. But, you know, on and off the police were, you know, kind of okay, but there was on occasions police officers that came into the town who, you know, didn't seem to understand and, you know, had one or two different problems with them. Walking through the street was something that I tended not to do, for the simple fact being that, you know, because of the shouts, you've got lots of people staring, lots of people making comments, and the more I worried about people, you know, looking and staring, the more the tics and the high-pitched squeals and yelps would occur. You know, it was something that, you know, as I say, I didn't usually tend to do, but I knew at some point in my life I had to go and do this, and it was something that, living in a town the size of Galashiels, I couldn't do anything or go anywhere without walking through the street.
It just feels like I have to say it. It's like somebody's forcing it out of me.
The actual urge, you know, when an urge comes on, and you know, these obsessive thoughts to actually have these shouts, to shout a swear word, to act in the way that I do, it's something that it's almost comes from deep inside, and this urge becomes an overwhelming feeling of, you know, extreme stress, and it's just almost like it's been forced out, as I say in the documentary. And no matter what I did to try and stop this, you know, you'll notice that I put my hand over my mouth to try and stop these tics coming out. It just didn't seem to work, you know. Maybe at the time it maybe subdued the tic from happening, but then seconds later, when I thought I was relaxed and the urge had gone, it would blur out. And it's almost like when I tried to control the tics, it built up and built up, and then when I was in a position where I felt, you know, no one was looking, it would, for about 10 minutes, I'd have these, you know, tic after tic after tic, jerks, you know, high-pitched squeals.
Perhaps because John is an adolescent.
You know, quite often headaches were a major problem for me because of the tics, with the head jerking, with the constant vocalisations, the body tics. I became so physically exhausted that towards the end of a day, I would just have to go and lie down and have a sleep. And again, it was the only time I got any kind of respite from the tics, from the you know, the kind of wild, kind of bizarre behaviours that Tourette's causes me, and what Tourette's causes me to behave like. In this scene, a lot of people see this kind of scene as quite, you know, a cult, you know, part of the documentary where, you know, I'm walking up looking for a jar of coffee, and I'm trying to be as controlled and have my behaviour as acceptable as I can, and then suddenly I come out with, you know, shouting a swear word at my mum, you know, calling her quite a defamatory name, And then we go to the coffee section and I suddenly shout, fucking Nescafe, which, yeah, when people first seen it in the documentary, found quite amusing, quite a funny scene. And it seems to be, you know, one of the scenes in the documentary that is more commonly, you know, remembered out of, you know, a few other scenes. Part of the documentary, after it was shown on TV, I felt that, you know, people are going to recognise the Tourette's not for, you know, a young 16-year-old with Tourette's. It must be really hard for the guy, but it seemed to be in the beginning. People remembered it for the humour, you know, the funny side to Tourette's at the time of watching it, but then afterwards, people, I think, tended to sit in groups of people, you know, sit and socialise and say, did you see that documentary the other night? That must be really hard for the guy. So I think the kind of feeling of empathy came after the documentary was actually shown rather than at the time. I mean, there's a scene in the documentary where I'm packing the bags, helping Mum, and I'm trying to, you know, do it as best as I can, and then I suddenly have this urge to shake the bag up in the air, which, you know, is the type of thing that you would more often not see anybody in the supermarket doing. So because it's, you know, that kind of extreme kind of behaviour to be doing in a supermarket, it almost makes the urge twice as, you know, hard, which even makes, you know, forces it to happen. There's lots of bits in the documentary that, you know, while we were doing the filming, there was bits I found very, very emotional, very hard to talk about. You know, there was bits that in the documentary I almost broke down in tears, but I felt I couldn't do that. I didn't want to put across to people that, you know, my life was so hard and so sad. I wanted so much to get across to people, you know, the problems that Tourette's caused, you know, how it kind of basically turned my life and my family's life into total turmoil. And as my mum says, there was a time where we thought I was actually going mad. But as time's gone on, I've learned that, you know, how can people, what gives people the right to, you know, determine, you know, what is mad, what isn't mad, you know, what is sanity and what is being insane. You know, the documentary actually helped me as well as probably help other people to, you know, understand and identify what the problem was. That's one of the main attributes and main kind of positives I got from the documentary. It allowed me to sit back and watch myself and look at the way I behaved and try and understand why I behaved like that. Because I think some people that, you know, maybe haven't come across Tourette's, they tend to think, yeah, he's got Tourette's, we know that, it's involuntary, but why? Why that specific behaviour? So I've kind of sat and I kind of try and put things into perspective and maybe try and work out why I'm behaving this way at this time. You know, what's going on in my life round about me. You know, there's times I can watch a film on TV where you know, there's a bit of violence in the film, and watching violence on TV tends to make my tics more pronounced, more, you know, extreme, to the extent, you know, you'll see part of the violence, there's machine guns going off. I'll kind of develop a tic where I'll be making a noise like, you know, a machine gun going off or an explosion. I'll make a sudden jump up in the air as if I'm being, you know, blown up myself. But in the part of the programme, you'll see me fishing at the side of the riverside. I found that very, very peaceful. You know, there's not a lot of people around. I felt no one was looking at me. And the noise of the river, it just felt, you know, so relaxing, and I felt at peace. And because it made me feel at peace, I felt I was getting respite from the tics. So I tended to, you know, every time I went out, I tended to get my fishing rod and I'd disappear away from everyone, away in the middle of the countryside, and I'd fish all day, which allowed me to have, you know, give me time myself, which I feel is very important for, you know, people who suffer from Tourette's, to be able to have that time out when they want it, to have their own space, to kind of wind down. You know, being around lots of people constantly, I enjoy. But yeah, there is times where I like to just go home, shut myself in my house and have a couple of hours just myself. I find sport very, very beneficial to me, you know. I find very therapeutic because I'm running about, I'm being physical. There's usually quite a lot of noise. And I find that there are areas of sport that I'm actually quite good at, you know, my balance, coordination. I wouldn't say I'm, you know, superb at football, superb at basketball, superb at any kind of ball sport, racket sport, but I mean, I can play it to a level where I'm comfortable and I feel that I'm good at it, and it gives me, you know, a way of, you know, burning energy and a release, if you like, from the kind of hypertension that I feel, you know, more often, you know, sometimes all day, from the time I wake up in the morning to the time I shut my eyes at night. I never stop. The tics are there, you know, the obsessive thoughts, the problems that arise throughout the day, you know, people staring, people approaching me in the street, you know, saying, you know, what are you swearing like that for? Don't swear like that in front of my child. And it gives me, you know, I have to kind of pluck up the courage to kind of try and explain what Tourette's is about. Quite often people look at me when I explain in the past, you know, round about when the documentary was made, I'd say, I've got Tourette's syndrome, I don't mean it, you know, it's involuntary, and people kind of looked at me as if to say, what's this guy talking about? I've never heard of Tourette's syndrome before. But then the effect the documentary had, which was a very, very important part of, you know, why I made the film, was it allowed people to know and discover and find out, you know, what Tourette's was, and to kind of, it was almost like it was, you know, here's the evidence that I've not been talking a lot of nonsense, it is a medical condition, it is involuntary, that, you know, please believe me, there's the evidence, it's hitting you right in the face there.
One teacher in particular pulled John out in front of the class.
School time was really, really hard. I found school extremely hard. There are times I'll sit and I'll wish, you know, I wish I could go back to school now. In the aspect that, you know, I can deal with my Tourette's now, I can deal with other people, the way other people react. So I feel I've got the confidence, I've got the kind of get up and go about me, where I could deal with, you know, being in a classroom, I would have the confidence to, you know, 10 minutes, I just needed time out, I would get up and leave the class. But at that time at school, I just could not focus on anything. I just had no confidence, no self-esteem. The documentary has really helped that. And, you know, the fact that it's almost given me this reassurance that, you know, people now know, people maybe sympathise, not that I want people to sympathise in the slightest, I just want them to understand, and that's what I think we got from the documentary. In the documentary, I felt, you know, there was lots that the documentary maybe didn't have that it maybe could have needed. At the time, they put across, you know, this lad with full-blown Tourette's, whole kind of range of symptoms, but I didn't feel that they kind of pinpointed the other associated disorders that actually come with Tourette's. I mean, you know, you'll see me in the documentary sitting in a classroom while I'm at college over lunchtime, eating my food, and I'm ticking and spitting my food out. The reason that, you know, that was shown in the documentary is because I chose to do that. I chose to actually eat my food away from everyone else because I couldn't deal with how other people reacted to me spitting food across the table when they were trying to eat. And I felt that was one way of being able to sit and eat my food without annoying other people. But now I've kind of adopted this attitude that I've got every right to go and sit where I want to sit for my lunch. People know I've got Tourette's. They know that, you know, I may have a tic where I spit and food comes out. So it's then the ball's kind of in their court. If they don't want to sit with me, that's their choice. I'm not going to go out my way to avoid a situation like that because I've got every right to be sit in a restaurant, go and have a meal, you know, go into a cafe and sit and have a coffee and have a roll, you know. The bit in the library was, in a way, as part of the documentary, I'd never ever done for many, many years. I think the last time I visited the library was in primary school on a school outing. Since then, I hadn't gone near a library. So in a way, they kind of set up this kind of, you know, part of the documentary where I was in the library. It was a quiet place. It's somewhere that someone with Tourette's,
Tourette syndrome
to
is one of
the
several
severity I had Tourette's,
gastroenterological disorders
would not
that
go
radically alter what we call normal
because
behaviour.
of it's quiet,
For one
when
man,
there is noise it
such depictions are so
echoes, and it's
fascinating,
somewhere where
he's
when
turned
you
stories
go,
about them into
it's somewhere where
best-selling
society
books.
accepts when you go to the library you be quiet.
Dr. Oliver
So I
Sacks.
think what they were trying to show in the documentary, this piece, was that going to a library for someone with Tourette's is not the easiest thing in the world. The amount of stress, the problems it can cause a sufferer and other people is absolutely, you know, it can be absolutely devastating for the sufferer to have to put himself in a position like that. But I think it got across to people, you know, that I wanted to go to the library, and the opportunity I had to go and do that while we were filming, it was a challenge for me. And again, challenges has become a major part of my life. When there's something that, you know, crops up in my life that I think, oh no, I couldn't do that because of my tics, because of my shouting, I stop and I think to myself, well no, I've got a right to go and do that. I would love to be able to try it, so let's just go for it, just do it. And then afterwards, 9 times out of 10, I'll come out of a situation like that and think, yes, I've done it. I feel good that I've done it. Yeah, there may have been people staring, people making comments, but I've dealt with it, and I feel good that I've dealt with it.
Maybe that medication would help him.
You know,
to some extent.
bits of the film where,
Get the
you
feeling
know,
that
they
he's
showed
still
me just
related to
sitting
medication.
quiet,
He
you
feels
know,
half dead.
trying to
That's
hold my
not-
mouth closed, and that I found very, very hard. And I found that at the time,
Most important
they
thing,
done that on purpose because they wanted to see how I coped with just somebody, you know, the camera being focused on me,
Coming to terms with
and
such a
how I would
complicated
deal with
reaction
just
form
having to
of
try and
Tourette's
sit
is
quiet,
not
which
easy.
for me at the time was something that was totally impossible
John
for me
made a
to
job.
do. Now,
Again,
I can
it's not
sit,
easy for someone
watch
who's had to
TV
swear
for
so
long
fast.
periods of time now, and only have a few tics, especially if I'm, you know, watching TV myself.
John's class arrives at the College Horticulture Centre.
I mean, there's lots of parts of the documentary that you see me that looked quite sad, quite, you know, I was really struggling at the time.
Because of his trouble
But
at
now,
school, John fell
I
behind in
tend
his studies
to think
and
that,
now
you know,
attends these special
I've
classes.
learned different
John
ways
is
of dealing
keen,
with certain
bright,
things.
and quick to learn.
Things like,
Ironically,
if I go to the
this is put
doctor's
him at the top
surgery,
of
or
his
if I
class.
go and stand in the bank and I'm having to sit or stand next to someone, I'll tend to sit on my hands, or I'll tend to kind of sit with my hand kind of over my mouth, just making it look as if I'm just, you know, sitting with my hand on my chin. Or I'll maybe pick up a magazine and try and take my mind away from, you know, that kind of scary thought of people sitting next to me and worrying about my tics. I try and take my mind off it by kind of thinking about other things.
And instead uses his enthusiasm
There's
to
lots of
motivate
different
the other
ways where,
students.
you know, I've had to learn to readapt to certain situations, which is something that each, I think, every individual with Tourette's differs to the extent where different sufferers deal with, you know, different situations differently, which I feel is quite important for a sufferer to be able to come to terms with. Yeah, it is harder for you to maybe go to the cinema, to go to the swimming pool, to be out in public, but there are ways of dealing with that. There is ways of getting round, you know, the way that, you know, if you like, society are making you feel because of your condition. In the documentary, you know, I was, as they say in the documentary, crossroads in my life where I'm changing from boy to man. You know, life was hard at that time, but having Tourette's as well as going through the kind of change of life, adolescence and things, made it twice as hard. And I think some people forget to, you know, they forget to kind of appreciate that, you know, youngsters with Tourette's, life's hard enough as it is without, you know, having to tackle a condition like Tourette's as well as just everyday life. And it's something that I feel that people tend to forget, you know, and people, sometimes I feel, you know, people really should stop and think when they're looking across at them in the street, when they're kind of mimicking them, especially at school, you know, with their peers, when they're taking the mickey, you know, they're kind of copying some of the text, just to stop and think and say, I'm making that guy feel really, really low, you know, as if, you know, making them feel like they just want a hole to appear and just to be swallowed up. It's, you know, something that I find society tends to kind of forget, that anybody with a disability is going through not just the normal problems that the life and the world throws at them, but the problem of, you know, having to come to terms with and live with a disability as well. I mean, the swearing part of the condition is it's quite a rare part of condition when you think that, you know, there is 1 in every 100 children now are being diagnosed with Tourette syndrome or unassociated behavioural disorder that comes with Tourette's, and that only 1 in 4 are boys.
All of us, I think, have
Sorry, 1 out of 4 sufferers are female and the rest are boys. And the, you know, the swearing part of the condition, which is, you know, medically, the medical term for it is coprolalia,
over the bounds of it.
is in, you know, a very small minority of sufferers. Not every sufferer suffers from the coprolalia part of the Tourette's. They may have the obsessive compulsive part of Tourette's where they maybe think, you know, these swear words and, you know, sexual thoughts, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they come out as a vocal tic. I mean, other parts of the condition, you know, vary from, you know, you have Tourette syndrome where, you know, I have full-blown Tourette syndrome, but there's parts of the condition where a child may have a mild facial tic with obsessive compulsive disorder, a child with ADHD, a child with a mild Asperger's. They may have an autistic spectrum disorder. There is dyslexia, there is dyspraxia, there is, you know, lots of different types of, you know, learning disabilities as well that come with Tourette's. So it doesn't just come with the vocal tics, the motor tics. It comes from quite often quite severe but hidden parts of the condition, you know, which more often than none can be sometimes the harder parts of the condition to be able to accept and to be able to cope with. At the time of the documentary, you know, my brother and sisters found it very hard to come to terms with and to be able to deal with and accept. But now, since the documentary and since I think a lot of the positive publicity that's come from the documentaries, they've kind of seen me as, you know, more of a big brother that they feel quite proud of, that I've achieved what I've achieved, and that, you know, it's something that, you know, I'll never forget, you know, missing out on, you know, being part of, if you like, a proper, you know, if you like, I hate this word, normal family unit, but, you know, I always felt kind of alien-like when I was young, suffering with a condition, that I wasn't the same as my brother and sisters. I wasn't, you know, I couldn't, you know, sit and, you know, mess around with them because the tics would always be there. They would always annoy them. They would always, you know, get upset about it. You know, I would shout, you know, sexual swear words around them and it would embarrass them. But now, as I say, since the documentary, you know, it doesn't seem to bother them. They've come to terms with the fact that they've got a big brother who's got Tourette's, who's been all over national TV, over national newspapers. And I think they do feel quite proud that I've achieved what I've achieved, considering that, you know, the fact that I struggled so much when I was younger.
Caroline has a friend.
You know, even my brothers and my sisters' friends now come up to me and give me a pat on the back and say, you know, I think that documentary was superb, it must have been really hard to do. And to me, you know, looking back, yeah, it was quite hard at the time, but now I feel it was nothing, you know, I wanted to do it. It was something that I needed to do. And that, you know, it's like water off a duck's back now. I've got so used to the kind of publicity aspect of Tourette's. You know, I would say I was, you know, one of the, you know, the big kind of, I wouldn't say celebrity, but, you know, the one person in the country that when someone mentions Tourette's, I'm the one who springs to mind, John Davidson, the guy for Galashiels in Scotland who's got Tourette's. Eating at a mealtime was very, very hard, especially having to, you know, sit and eat with the family, especially with, you know, the spitting tic. That kind of started off when I was about, I would say, 16, 17. You know, it got to its worst round about then. I mean, it was always there, but it kind of, you know, manifested into, you know, spitting food about and thing. It was something I didn't want to do, but it was just something I just couldn't stop doing. In the documentary as well, you'll notice that, you know, I was at a, you know, a college where, you know, I was getting lots of support in the classroom. I was in a group of, you know, with other young people who also had their own problems with their own disabilities, who were, you know, struggling with life, which, you know, at the time I felt I really benefited from. But looking back now, you know, I feel quite, you know, hurt and upset that, you know, academically I was able to, you know, do the normal classwork that, you know, I would have, you know, that I've kind of missed out on in school. But it really helped me to come to terms with, you know, being around people and looking at other people with problems and realise that I'm not the only person, you know, with a problem. You know, but I mean, there are lots of situations throughout my life suffering with Tourette's that, you know, I've looked at and seen the funny side of. You know, there was one experience where I was in a supermarket and there was a poor old dear old lady, you know, looking in a freezer unit in the local freezer shop in Galashiels. And as I walked past, I let out this really, I mean, as I can remember, a high-pitched, you know, yelp. And this poor old lady got such a fright that she actually dropped the lid of the freezer down on top of herself, you know, and I had this kind of, if you think of this mental picture, this poor old lady kind of legs dangling out this freezer, you know, which I see a funny side to, but yet there's still this element of seriousness, you know, that it could be quite dodgy at times. I mean, making the documentary at the time was great fun. The production crew were absolutely superb, you know, very understanding. They'd done a lot of research, you know, they seemed to know a lot about Tourette's. And it was very sad at the end of the time, you know, when they were shooting the film, you know, when everyone left and when there was quite a bit of tears, you know, and I felt almost like, you know, that they give me this sense of security that someone was actually doing something at last to let people know what Tourette's was about. And I felt that, you know, they were so sincere in what they were doing, and I felt that I could trust them 100% in getting the documentary, you know, just right and how, you know, I thought it should be portrayed. So I tend not to dwell on the past. I tend to look forward. Yeah, there are times where I look, you know, a way back at what it was like when I was in hospital for months and months on end, when I couldn't cope with being around people, when I used to shut myself in the room, you know, all the bad memories I had of school. But it's something that I tend not to do too often, because I feel that if you kind of dote in the past, it kind of, you know, it doesn't seem for me healthy, because, you know, it can make me feel quite down and depressed, and, you know, I tend to not like to think I wish it could be different, because at the end of the day, nothing's going to change the past. You know, these things have occurred. You just need to kind of deal with it, you know, get on with life and just take day by day as it comes. Try not look too far into the future, and just do the best you can. Come to terms with Tourette's. Allow other people round about you to get to know you as a person without the Tourette's. But the Tourette's is always going to be there, yeah, but there is a real person sometimes, you know, more often than none, underneath the surface of the Tourette syndrome. And that's one of the most important things you need to kind of get a grasp of. Let yourself be yourself. Tourette's is there, yeah, but just let it be. Try not and let it stress you out. People round about you who really care about you aren't going to, you know, be offended by it. They understand. And the more that you can build your confidence, gain self-esteem, the more you'll find life easier to deal with, and to be able to pass on and educate other people for the future about Tourette syndrome.
Come on. Stop.